high mountain range. So yeah, it's a cool frog. I'll go on about it. So it is a small brown frog. So often I take people looking for frogs and show them these cool things like Crinia and Pseudophorine, all that sort of stuff. And like, oh, it's a small brown frog. Why should I be impressed? All frogs have a story, you just got to get to know them. But yeah, these guys, they are just a generic small brown frog. You can see, quite cute looking. It's a bit of a newly discovered thing. A little bit older now. I think it was described in 1994, so it was found about then too. It's only found in the sort of southwest of Tasmania. You see the map down the bottom there. I don't know what the record north of Hobart is. That doesn't seem to be right. It's mostly known from mountain ranges. So, up in the clouds and these really cold, rainy sort of areas. I think at Hart's Mountain, where they were described, it rains 220 days a year there or something. So it's very cold and wet. But apparently it also occurs in low elevations. So in the type description, it refers to populations in rainforests at pretty much sea level, when I've never actually seen a photo of one from there. So I don't know, but it would be cool. It's got a kind of a cool breeding strategy. So like a lot of the Myobatrachid frogs in Australia, they might lay their eggs on the ground. So these guys have these sort of really big jelly eggs, which are sort of laid in amongst the moss in their habitat. And the tadpoles, the nest kind of sort of breaks down a bit into a sort of a jelly puddle, and the tadpoles sort of just swim around in there. So there's no sort of real free living tadpole stage. They're not dependent on water to breed in or anything like that, just moist sort of moss or leaf litter. And you can sort of see the embryos kind of developing in there. Now, I don't think they're not really a true direct developer like some of the microhylids, because they do kind of break out of the egg a little bit. But yeah, they're kind of a cool strategy of breeding. So another interesting thing about this frog is it has a bit of a contested taxonomy. So it was originally described in a monotypic genus, Bryobatrachus. Given the differences, sort of the unique sort of characters of this frog, particularly the breeding habit, there's also some stuff about its sort of morphology that was a bit different. However, in 2001, there was a genetic study that had a look at all the Crinia species and a lot of other Myobatrachid frogs in general, and they found that Bryobatrachus was actually quite closely related to Crinia tasmaniensis. So they actually lumped Bryobatrachus back in with Crinia to try and resolve this monophyly issue. So if you can see the tree down here, Bryobatrachus comes right out the top. Had that been the only frog on that branch, they could have held it in that genus happily, but Crinia tasmaniensis comes out with it. So there's a couple ways to sort of resolve that, but they went with the more conservative way. But interestingly, a few of the sort of field guides that have come out post this revision have sort of ignored it. So Marion Anstis's tadpole book and Simon's frog book have both included the frog in the monotypic genus Bryobatrachus. So I remember when Marion first was going to do this, she was talking to me before a book came out, and she was all worried that all the geneticists were going to, be really angry at her for going out on her own and doing this. But if you look at the morphology, and there's some other reasons you'd want to sort of keep this frog in its own sort of own genus. So yeah, I mentioned it has a close relationship with Crinia tasmaniensis, and that there are a couple other ways they could have resolved this monophyly issue. So if they could have, which they did do, was put Bryobatrachus back into Crinia, but you could either put Crinia tasmaniensis into the same genus as Bryobatrachus, or put Crinia tasmaniensis into its own genus. So there's actually been a proposed monotypic genus for Crinia tasmaniensis before, and that was Australo.
I've got a quick question.
Yep.
Which one was described first?
Well, Bryobatrachus is the most recent.
Because then Crinia tasmaniensis would have priority.
Yeah, it would. Crinia tasmaniensis came out before. So if you lumped Crinia tasmaniensis and Bryobatrachus into the same genus, you'd probably call this Australocrinia thing, which was a Hire and Liam name from 1976. But you could have Crinia tasmaniensis in its own genus and Bryobatrachus in its own genus as well, and still have a happy tree. So there's a few interesting things about Crinia tasmaniensis. It's a little bit different from the rest of the Crinia. So I'd say this is probably worth looking into more in the future. But yeah, that's pretty much how it stands on genetics. The other interesting thing about this tree is you can see the genetic distance between some of these Western Australian Crineus species, Insignifera, Subinsignifera, and Pseudinsignifera. They're very closely related, so much more so than some of the populations of Crineus signifera. So you see there's a lot of distance between some of those Crineus signifera populations right down the bottom. So that kind of says to me, like, using this genetic distance stuff alone to differentiate species isn't a good thing to do necessarily, because the Western Australian Crineus species have quite distinct calls. There's no confusing them. Whereas Crineus signifera, you'd probably want to keep that all one species. Anyway, here's a shot of the habitat. So this is up in Harts Mountain. So this is sort of my story with this frog. So yeah, I've seen this species in the wild. This is a spot. All these photos are my photos from when I was down there. One of my mates was actually in Tasmania doing some frogging, and he went up to this Harts Mountain spot, and he could hear the frogs calling, and they make like a very soft, like a sort of sound from in the moss, and they're quite timid, so they're quite hard to find. And he sent me a message. He's like, "Oh, I'm down in Tassie trying to find this frog. Can you help me out?" So I'm like, "Sure." I booked the next flight to Hobart, flew down, and then met up with my mate in Tassie, and we went up to Harts Mountain. Sure enough, the plane was delayed a few hours, cutting into our valuable frogging time. But we got there in the end, and it was raining, it was cold, it was pretty miserable. It took us hours, to find one of these frogs, because they're very, very timid. So you get close to one and it sort of stops calling. So then you move on to the next one, it stops calling. And, a few hours later, you've done a circle around the whole site. But eventually we did find one. So that was really cool. And yeah, that's the belly pattern. So yeah, it's not just a small brown frog. It's a small brown frog with a cool story. And that's it. Yep.